On a calm afternoon in 1974, a young chimpanzee named Hody sat alone in Gombe National Park, Tanzania, eating fruit from a tree. Without warning, he was swarmed by attackers. A patrol of 6 other chimpanzees had found him alone and decided to strike. A male named Humphrey grabbed Hody's leg to stop him from fleeing and threw him to the ground. Humphrey held Hody down as the others pummeled him, hitting and biting him over and over. After 10 minutes of constant beating, Humphrey released Hody and the attackers fled. The chimp laid there, still, for many minutes. Finally, he stood and stared into the forest. Blood ran down his face. He let out a long scream and limped away. This was the last time that Hody was seen in Gombe, and the attack marks the beginning of what's now called the Gombe Chimpanzee War. The years-long conflict pitted friend against friend, mother against daughter, and sent ripples through the community for decades. Jane Goodall was among the researchers studying in Gombe at the time, and she was stunned by what followed. The same animals she had observed using tools and forming tight social bonds were apparently capable of the kind of sustained and organized violence that in humans we would call war. So how far back does our predisposition for this kind of violence go? I'm Lindsay Nicole, and on my own channels, I talk about evolution and zoology. This is a perfect case study for some of the deeper questions in both of those fields. Although it happened 50 years ago, the Gombe Chimpanzee War continues to be one of the most shocking events in the history of primatology. And in another part of Africa, it may be happening again. Our story starts in 1960, more than a decade before the conflict began. A young Jane Goodall first arrived in Gombe, sent to study chimps by the famed paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey. Louis was a dynastic figure, the first of 3 generations of Leakeys to work on human origins research in East Africa. He was the director of the National Museum of Kenya and was dead set on getting more researchers out to the field to study modern apes. And not just because modern apes are very cool, that is true. But Leakey thought that to understand the origins of the great apes and ourselves, we needed to know more about modern apes too. And yes, chimps are totally different species from humans, not the ancestors of humans. Our common ancestor was alive sometime between 6 to 8 million years ago. So, there's a limited amount we can learn from their behavior and apply it to ourselves. But it never hurts to learn more.
Well, when Jane first was sent to Gombe to look at chimpanzees by Louis Leakey, nothing really was known about their behavior in the wild.
That's Dr. Ann Pusey, a researcher who worked in Gombe in the early 1970s. We wanted to talk to her to get a sense of what the early days were like and what made the work done at Gombe so important.
Louis Leakey was a paleoanthropologist, so he was interested in what our closest living relatives, how they lived, and what that might help us understand about what the ancestors were like, the bones of the different Homo species that he was discovering in Olduvai.
Aside from our direct ancestors, Leakey was interested in a fossil ape called Proconsul, which he argued was the earliest true ape. So it was the direct ancestor of us, chimpanzees, and all the other modern apes. Proconsul lived in an environment almost identical to the places where modern chimps live, and which was especially similar to Gombe National Park. So Leakey wanted to know more about chimps living in that environment as a proxy for his fossil ape.
So when Jane first went out there, she was really the first to be able to get close enough to the chimps to actually see what they were doing every day. And so absolutely everything was interesting to her and to Leakey. And the early discoveries she made really excited people, that they made and used tools, that they hunted animals, they hunted monkeys, and that they shared meat. And so these were all things which we know are important in human societies, and seeing that our closest living relatives already did some of these things was really exciting.
These discoveries completely changed our understanding of chimpanzees, but Jane had only gotten to see them at a distance, through binoculars. She knew that if she could get closer, she would be unlocking a totally different world. Her job was straightforward: find all the chimpanzees and convince them to let her get close. But that wasn't going to be easy. Chimps, like other wild animals, are not necessarily down to be followed around by humans. That is to say, strangers who have clothes on. So before she could learn anything about them, Jane had to get them accustomed to her presence. One way she did this was by feeding them bananas, because who's gonna turn down a banana? She wasn't literally handing out bananas, though. There are these 2 little feeding stations not too far from the researchers' camps where they'd stash the fruits that they could open from a distance when the chimps got close. And put a pin in that, because we're gonna talk about the banana feeding stuff again later. But for now, the thing to know is that the bananas were a key part of how the chimps got used to her. enough to let her follow them around. With time, this turned into letting groups of researchers follow them around too. And this is when the researchers started to understand what a day in the life of a Gombe chimp was like, away from the feeding stations and in their actual home environments. The Gombe forest is big, and there are more chimps than there are researchers to study them. So a pair of researchers would pick one chimp to follow around from when they got up in the morning until they made their nest at night. One researcher would take notes of their behaviors on a form called a check sheet, using specific behavior codes and writing down what time every event happened. The other researcher would take broader, narrative notes and include what the other chimps in the area were doing as well. With time, you'd get a picture of the whole social network of the chimpanzees, who likes to hang out with who, which male is in charge, etc. And these records go back decades, all the way to the early years at Gombe. So today, you could go back to a random day in 1970 and see what chimp took a bite of a fruit at exactly what time, and then what time they took the next bite of fruit, and also if they spit a little bit of it out. That's insane. A check sheet from 1970 looks basically the same as one that researchers would use today, which makes it easy to compare decades of data all at once. And with enough years of data, you can see how these social groups changed too, which is what Goodall and her colleagues started to see in the early 1970s. At the time, there were three main chimp communities in Gombe: the Matumba in the north, the Kalande in the south, and the Kasekela in the middle. Kasekela is the group that Goodall had been studying since she arrived. And at the beginning of the 1970s, she could see something odd was happening. Researchers had known for a while that there were two cliques of chimps within Kasekela, based on who came to the feeding stations. The members of those cliques would still interact with the group at large, just not as often. Gombe staff noticed that the southern clique wasn't coming to the feeding stations as often as the northern group would, even if they put out extra bananas to try and encourage them. The two groups spent less and less time together as the years passed, and even seemed like they were avoiding each other altogether. Though the researchers didn't know it, this was the beginning of a conflict that would get deadly. But before we get into all of that, we need to talk about chimpanzee social behavior. Chimps live in big groups of lots of males and lots of females. They have a social pecking order where males are usually higher ranked than females, all leading up to the alpha of the group. The male chimpanzees, who get stuff like first dibs at best food, the most attention and grooming from others in their community, that kind of thing. So the opposite of what happens with self-proclaimed alphas in our communities. In chimp groups, the males stay in the group they were born into, while females usually have to migrate into a new territory to avoid inbreeding. That means that males can gain more social capital over their lives, building more complex social networks with each other than the females do. Researchers can usually tell who's the alpha based on the chimp's social behaviors. They look for who does the most dominance displays, where the chimps throw sticks around, puff up their hair and stuff, and the rest of the group will acknowledge the alpha by making a submissive sound called a pant grunt, lowering their stance, or by running away. And even the alpha may not win every contest. So for the most part, researchers tend to say that the chimp who wins the fights the most often is the alpha, even if other males might ruffle him up from time to time. But the alphas don't stay alphas forever. It's not uncommon for a chimp to be the alpha for a few years at a time, but then as he gets older and weaker, he gets overthrown by a younger and stronger male in the group. Which brings us to another quirk about chimp social groups. Even though their groups are bigger than those of a lot of other apes, you don't really see everyone all together all at once very often. They have what's called a fission-fusion social system. Even though the whole community may be big, you'll only see smaller groups hanging out at a given time. Some animals will keep their whole group together all the time, like a flock of geese, or a herd of zebras, or a flamboyance of flamingos. But chimps don't do that. They have big social networks that can have dozens or even hundreds of chimpanzees within a territory, but they'll only get together in much smaller groups of 5 or 10 chimps, usually either to gather fruit or hunt for meat. Yes, meat. Chimps will hunt down and eat colobus monkeys, and at another research site called Fungoli, they've even been seen spear hunting bush babies for a quick meal. Chimps will also group up for something called a patrol, where a handful of them, usually males, scope out the edges of their territory looking for any rival chimps. And if they find any, they'll either scare them off or attack. We now know they're not shy about killing members of rival groups if they come across them, especially if the rival is outnumbered. And these territorial attacks can be absolutely heinous to witness. But the researchers at Gombe didn't know any of this yet. At the time, when Jane Goodall got to Gombe, she'd assumed that chimpanzees were a docile, vegetarian species. That was our understanding of chimpanzees. Obviously, that is no longer the case. The brutal attacks that they were about to witness were the very first chimp-on-chimp attacks ever seen by researchers. Now that that's out of the way, let's go back to the main story. Like we've said, the researchers at Gombe noticed that a group of males were getting cliquey starting back in 1971. And in order to unpack what they saw, we asked Dr. Richard Wrangham, another researcher who was at Gombe at the time, to introduce us to the main players there in the early 70s. We'll start with Mike, who was the alpha of the Kasekela group right up until around 1971.
The situation in the Kasekela community in the competition for dominance was that after the old male Mike had been defeated, I think, by Humphrey, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. I'm not sure if anyone knows, who it was that really toppled Mike. There was some tension between the rivals for the alpha male position.
So with Mike's overthrow, there was a bit of a power struggle for who would take the alpha status. And the three main players in the struggle were Humphrey, Charlie, and Hugh.
Humphrey was a very brave, bold, annoying character who I think was not very good at forming alliances with others, but was good at fighting others himself. So he was one candidate to be alpha male, and the only ones who put up serious resistance to that, or the only one who put up serious resistance to that, was a slightly younger male, Charlie, who had the advantage of having his elder brother, Hugh, as a very predictable ally. And Hugh and Charlie, as I remember, spent the great majority of their time traveling together.
The brothers Charlie and Hugh were agitators, liked to stir the pot. They were not particularly happy about Humphrey's promotion.
I think it's fair to say that there would be unresolved interactions between Humphrey and Hugh and Charlie. Now, I think there's a kind of complexity in understanding what's going on here, because it may well have been, and I think it probably was the case, that Hugh and Charlie charging together, literally just inches apart as they sweep through this relatively open little area, could well dominate and chase any other male, including Humphrey. But the complexity is that it seems as though it doesn't really count if a male is dominated in an aggressive interaction by two others. Humphrey can run away screaming. Hugh and Charlie can sit where Humphrey had sat and have their hair out and look proud and achieving. But it's unlikely under those conditions that the victim will actually give the critical sound, which is the pant grunt, that signals unambiguously, okay, you have defeated me and I acknowledge you as the dominant.
So even if Hugh and Charlie weren't into Humphrey becoming the new alpha, the two of them together weren't really able to do anything about it. And because of that, it seems like Hugh and Charlie and their friend group started to spend more time apart from the rest of the pack. Another chimp that we need to talk about is Goliath. He was a highly ranked male in Kasekela and had even been the alpha until sometime around 1964. But even after he lost that status, it seemed like he was still pretty well liked in the group. Dr. Pusey recalls spending time watching him in the early 1970s before the split.
Well, when I got to Gombe, Goliath was obviously an oldish male. He was fairly bald on top, and he wasn't very high ranking, but he was absolutely part of the group, and he'd often come to the feeding area and he'd groom with the other males. I spent quite a bit of time with Goliath, partly because there was a young male, Sniff, who was an adolescent at the time. He was probably about 10 to 12 when I was spending time at Gombe. And I was interested in adolescent males and how they became independent and how they became, joined the male group. And Sniff used to follow Goliath a lot. And Sniff tended to hang out with those southern males. But Goliath was also groomed with northern males, and there was another old male called Hugo. So Goliath was definitely part of the group, but he was low ranking when I knew him.
Goliath is one of the first two chimps that Goodall observed making and using tools, by the way. And this is the finding that catapulted Gombe and Goodall to household name status. So Jane loved Goliath, and we also love Goliath. Just keep that in mind. As tensions rose between the Kasekela males, the researchers started to see evidence of a rift forming within the group. The southern group, led by Hugh and Charlie, would spend more time grooming each other than they would with other members of the larger party. And they even stopped coming to the feeding stations, passing up free food just to avoid someone. Things were clearly getting very bad. That southern group consisted of 7 males and 3 females, plus their dependent offspring. There was Charlie, Hugh, Goliath, and Hody, who we mentioned before. Then there was Day, Willy Wally, and Sniff, the young male Dr. Pusey mentioned. The females were Madam B and her daughters, Little B and Honeybee. as well as Mandy and Wanda. By the end of 1972, it was clear that this group had completely left Kasekela, and at this point became known to the researchers as the Kahama group. There were too many chimps in the Kasekela group for us to name here, but the ones that are part of this story are Humphrey, Satan, Goblin, brothers Figgin and Fabin, Everett, Sherry, Homeo, Hugo, and a female called Gigi. The Kahama group occupied the southern end of what had been Kasekela territory, making Kasekela's total turf a little smaller, but not enough to cause a ruckus about. So the two groups seemed to coexist like this for about a year, and while their territories were right next to each other, there weren't any observed clashes between them. Until one afternoon in January of 1974. Jane Goodall details the events of the Gombe Chimp War in her book Through a Window, My 30 Years with the Chimpanzees of Gombe. And just as a warning, the descriptions of some of these attacks are brutal, like really bad. It'll become very clear that chimps don't have war crime limitations. So, buckle up. The first violent event between the two groups was that attack on Hody, which we talked about at the beginning of the video. It lasted about 10 minutes, and while Hody did walk away from the incident, researchers never saw him again, leading them to conclude he died of his injuries. The next Kahama chimp to be attacked was Day. A patrol from Kasekela consisting of Sherry, Homeo, Everett, and Gigi beat him for at least 20 minutes. Day was seen 2 months after this attack, still injured and emaciated. While researchers were able to follow him for a few days, he eventually disappeared, so he likely died of his wounds. And while these first attacks were shocking, the third one blew them out of the water. In a bad way, because this time, the raiding party found Goliath. The researchers still didn't know why Goliath ended up leaving Kasekela. Most of the other males that left for Kahama had never been as highly ranked as Goliath once had been, even though that was years before this war. And in the case of Hugh and Charlie, they'd specifically been reaching for the alpha status that Goliath used to have. So it kind of makes sense why those males would want to start a new group. But for Goliath, the reasoning is less clear. Like we said earlier, the chimps in Kasekela liked him enough to make him the alpha once upon a time. Goliath's attack happened in February of 1975, a full year after the beating that Day received. 5 adult males, Figgin and Fabin, Humphrey, Satan, and Homeo, charged him. Fabin reached him first and held him to the ground. Then Satan and the rest of the group arrived, and they all stamped on his body, pummeled him with their fists, and even lifted him off the ground and threw him back onto the forest floor. Then, Fabin twisted Goliath's leg around and around, in the same way that chimps dismember colobus monkeys after they hunt them down. Remember, Goliath was old, and even a chimpanzee in his prime would have had low odds of survival after an assault like this, so it wasn't unexpected that he was never seen again. Then came the first female casualty, Madam B. She was also pretty old and had been disabled by an outbreak of polio. She and her daughters were attacked several times by Kasekela, the first of which happened in September of 1974. And after that first attack, something really odd happened. After the Kasekela males were done attacking Madam B, her older daughter, Little B, followed the Kasekela group back to the north, leaving her mother and sister behind. Over the months that followed, Madam B was accosted by northern males at least 4 times, and researchers often observed her with fresh injuries. The final attack on Madam B was as brutal as those on any of the males. This surprised Goodall and the other researchers, who assumed that the females who had joined Kahama would have been welcome to return to Kasekela. But when the patrol found Madam B in the fall of 1975, it was clear that wouldn't be the case. Researchers arrived at the scene after the attack had already begun. Figgin, Satan, Homeo, and Sherry were surrounding Madam B, beating her ferociously. And watching from the sidelines was Little B. She'd stayed with Kasekela after that first attack, and would sometimes join Kasekela patrol parties traveling south. So she watched as her companions attacked her mother. At one point, the males started to leave, and Madam B tried to stand. Satan and Figgin charged at her and beat her again until she fell. This happened again and again, until finally the males were done. After the attack, researchers searched for Madam B for 2 days, and only discovered where she'd hidden when they spotted Honeybee, perched in the tree above her mother. She took care of her mom for 4 days, until Madam B passed away. Honeybee did survive this war, and would come back to Kasekela as an occasional visitor in the following years. She returned to her birth group when she was fertile, but she never stayed. Researchers didn't observe the next attack firsthand, but local fishermen told them they'd heard chimps screaming somewhere in the forest. 3 days later, the researchers found Charlie's body by a stream, covered with wounds. His brother Hugh had vanished back in 1972, without a trace. So it's unclear if he was attacked before the war truly began, or if he joined some other group or just died of something else. Another male named Willy Wally, who'd also been disabled by polio, disappeared not long after. This left only one male and two females in the Kahama group. Trapped between their former Kasekela group in the north and the Kalande to the south, there was nowhere for them to escape. The final confirmed attack in this war was against Sniff, the youngest. A Kasekela patrol found him in November of 1977, and just as old age had not spared Goliath or Willy Wally, youth didn't save Sniff either. Figgins, Satan, and Goblin were the first to reach him, and their excited shrieks brought Homeo, Sherry, and Everett to the scene. By then, Sniff was bleeding badly, and researchers watched as Satan drank blood from Sniff's face. Yeah. Satan and Sherry dragged him by his legs down a slope, and the group continued their assault for several more minutes until they decided the job was done. Researchers saw Sniff the next day, but never again, so he was presumed to have died from his injuries within a week of the attack. The final two females were also never seen again, and while it's possible they integrated into the Kalande group, it's more likely that they too were killed by Kasekela raiding parties. I know this looks super messy, but Honeybee and Littlebee are still alive. But ultimately, the Kahama group had been completely eliminated. So, that was horrific. I don't think I've ever heard of something this brutal in the animal kingdom, excluding us. It's hard to imagine what the aftermath of something like this was gonna look like. And as it turns out, it wasn't even that great for Kasekela. Remember, the Kahama group's territory was to the south, right between Kasekela and the rival group Kalande. By killing their former friends, Kasekela had knocked out the buffer between them and the Kalande chimps, and created a territory vacuum in the middle. The Kalande group moved north and claimed the former Kahama territory for their own, killing more of the Kasekela chimps and forcing them back towards the north. Two males died, including Humphrey, the alpha. After losing that territory to the south, they tried to move up into the valley where the Matumba chimp group lived in search of food. The Matumba group was larger and stronger than Kasekela, and by all accounts, Matumba should have been able to fend off Kasekela. If they'd attacked, Matumba could have ended them. But somehow, Kasekela survived. Barely, but survived. Things eventually calmed down, and an uneasy balance between the three groups was reached. After nearly 10 brutal years, the Gombe Chimpanzee War was over. So what came from all of this? For the chimps, and also for our understanding of chimp behavior. It's taken researchers decades to try and put the pieces together of why this happened, and there's still no one good answer. Fundamentally, it doesn't make sense for a group of chimpanzees to do this. They're territorial animals, and they rely on having lots of healthy males to defend their territory. So for a bunch of those males to just up and leave means that both groups are smaller, and that leaves them even more vulnerable to further attacks, which is exactly what happened to Kasekela after they killed off Kahama. For some reason, they turned on each other even though remaining together as a group would have made them all safer. After that, Kasekela suddenly viewed Kahama as such an unacceptable threat to their territory that war was their only option. And researchers have, from time to time, used that word war. Some scientists consider that an unacceptable level of anthropomorphism, describing something that isn't human as though it is. But is it really anthropomorphic? If humans split from one another and engaged in this level of sustained conflict, we'd call that a war over territory. And to be clear, this was at its core a territory issue. Kasekela didn't set out to murder their former friends and allies in cold blood. Chimps go on boundary patrols to protect their turf all the time. And when these patrols encounter rival chimps, they will attack. But the key word here is rival. The southern chimps used to be considered part of Kasekela, and then they were not. Something changed to the point where Kasekela patrols found chimps that they knew, thought rival, and acted accordingly. That shift where allies became rivals is the thing that has baffled researchers for so long, and the thing that demands explanation. There's genetic evidence that permanent group splits like this one are super rare. In one study, researchers used the Y chromosomes from chimps from several sites to reconstruct how old their groups were. To make a long story short, they used the mutation rate of the Y chromosome to make a family tree for the whole group, and calculated how long ago that chimp group was founded. And the researchers estimated that their youngest community was about 125 years old, and that their oldest two were both over 2,000 years old. So yeah, these kinds of splits just don't happen out of the blue, which makes understanding what happened here all the more interesting, even today. That's why researchers, including Dr. Pusey, went back through the old check sheets and records to model the changing social dynamics in Gombe throughout the 1970s to try to get to the bottom of it all. And they found that of all the things going on in Gombe at the time, there were two likely catalysts for the fighting. One is that the dominant struggle between Humphrey, Hugh, and Charlie was itself the cause. Without group consensus on an alpha, it's natural that chimps and Kasekela might have taken sides. And it definitely seems like there was some seriously messy social interaction going on between the group's males. But the other cause may have been been that there was a stress of a very particular nature in the group. See, chimps have this thing where females' butts get all red and swollen when they're ovulating, so the males know exactly when they have a shot at fathering offspring. In the early 1970s, most of the females in the group weren't cycling. They were either too old, too young, or had recently given birth and hadn't started ovulating again. There was also just an unusually high proportion of males in the group at the time, which meant that there were very few opportunities to breed. And that could have made these male chimps a bit testy. And to this day, the ratio of males to ovulating females in Kasekela has never gotten as high as it was before the fission. So it could be that this was already a stressful time to be a Kasekela male. When you add on the fact that nobody could agree who should be the alpha, that could be a combination of rare factors that led to this split. But weirdly enough, that sex ratio may have been what saved Kasekela from Matumba, too. See, even after the losses and all these years of fighting, they still had a lot of male chimpanzees. And in particular, they had a lot of adolescent males. While younger males may not be great in a fight, they sound just like full-grown adult males when they're making their territorial calls. It's possible that they managed to scare off Matumba because they sounded like they'd be harder to fight than they really were. So a really unique set of circumstances probably led to a really unique fission event. We can't know for sure, but it's still worth trying to understand what made everything boil over. Which brings us back to the controversial banana feeding that I mentioned earlier. See, there's an idea floating around that the banana feeding caused two separate groups to temporarily hang out with each other in order to get those bananas. Some researchers even argue that this wasn't a group split at all, and was just a temporary banana-based alliance falling apart. But this study looked into that too, and they found that there was no correlation between changes to the banana feeding schedule and increased tensions between the two groups. The idea that they were always two groups also falls apart when you consider Goliath. He was literally the alpha of Kasekela, so if Kahama had always been its own group, he wasn't in it. It makes way more sense that these chimps were in one cohesive group until the alpha shakeup caused them to split. Part of what makes the Gombe Chimp War so confusing to researchers is that, for decades, it was the only time that anyone had seen anything like it happen. And a big challenge is that when your sample size is 1, there is only so much you can really learn from the thing. But Gombe may not be totally unique after all. Researchers at a site in Uganda called Ngogo think there's a chimpanzee community split happening there today, with similarly bloody results. Just like in Gombe, they've started to see certain group members spend more time with each other than they did with others. They've seen 3 separate subgroups or neighborhoods forming, one in the west, one in the east, and one in the center. But for a long time, these groups were pretty chill with each other.
But then in the summer of 2015 was when everything changed.
That's Aaron Sandel, who spoke to us from Ngogo, where he and his colleagues are studying what seems like another active split and conflict. And by active, I mean some of the action was happening during our interview.
There might even be a territorial conflict happening just to the south. I heard that the Westerners were traveling east this afternoon. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a territorial interaction. Hopefully they don't kill any of the other chimps.
Like I said, active. Aaron gave us the breakdown of what's been happening in Ngogo over the last few years.
There was a day that I was with a big group of the Western chimpanzees, and they were traveling from the sort of far west of their range to the center of the territory. And all of a sudden, they got nervous. They became quiet. They were sort of reassuring each other with a touch. Some of them were grimacing. And they were acting like they were hearing stranger chimps from the chimps that they wouldn't know, that they would have these territorial conflicts with. But we were in the middle of the territory. I was starting to hear other chimps, but it must have been the chimps from the central neighborhood. And sure enough, it was. And John Matani and another researcher, Rachna Reddy, were with them. So the central chimpanzees were in earshot, and for some reason, the Western chimps were acting as if they were nervous. More nervous than usual. And then when the central chimps sort of became into view, rather than reunite in typical fission-fusion fashion, the Western chimpanzees ran and the central chimpanzees chased them. And nothing like this had been observed before.
Ever since that day, when members of the Western group encounter the central or eastern chimps, they put on threat displays and make aggressive calls, just like they would do when encountering a chimp from a rival community. And these displays have escalated to full-on violent attacks. What's even weirder is that so far, this aggression has all been coming from one direction.
It's the Western chimpanzees who have done all the attacks, all the lethal attacks. And initially, it was both Western and Central chimps that would engage in these territorial patrols. But after the second lethal attack, it's like the Central and Eastern chimpanzees, they stopped patrolling to the west. I don't know if it's out of fear or something else, but it's almost like they've given up. They don't really defend their territory, and they definitely don't go on the offense. So it's the Western chimpanzees who are doing all the offense, doing all the lethal attacks.
Which is interesting, since that's the same pattern we saw in Gombe, where only the Kasekela chimps continue to patrol their newly contested border. Kahama never seemed to patrol further north. And even though this all started at Ngogo back in 2015, researchers still aren't completely sure why it's happening. So to try to get a better sense of it all, they've tried to identify any major shakeups in the group that happened around the time it all kicked off, just like researchers did for the Gombe Chimp War. They're still in the very early days of unpacking it all, but there's one possibility that, if true, would also shed light on the events of Gombe. See, right before all these events unfolded at Ngogo, there was a dominance hierarchy shift, resulting in a chimp named Jackson becoming the new alpha. In fact, the very first day researchers saw Western chimps treating central chimps so strangely, the central group they'd happened across included Jackson. So if a dominance upset is part of the story at Ngogo, that lends support to the idea that it was part of the story at Gombe too. But researchers aren't sure of that. And there's lots of reasons to think the Ngogo situation isn't a perfect parallel. There are a lot more chimps at Ngogo than there ever were in Gombe, for example. So it isn't exactly apples to apples, or bananas to bananas. Even though having 2 chimp conflicts to study is better than 1, that still isn't all that much information. So it's hard to tell what else we can even learn from this second event. It's worth pointing out again that a lot of the violence that happened during the Chimpanzee War sounds really, really bad. Like drinking blood off your enemy's face feels like a Game of Thrones episode. But there's no evidence that the attacks in this war were any worse than what rival chimps without any history would do to each other. For instance, in 2005, researchers recorded a chimp attack in Gombe National Park in Gabon that happened right outside their camp. The lone victim was found dead, and his genitals were torn from his body and tossed 20 meters away. DNA evidence found that this lone chimp was in all likelihood not a part of the group that attacked him. So this kind of attack is just par for the course when it comes to how chimps deal with rivals. And that gets us back to the fundamental difference that's at the heart of both the Gombe War and what's happening in Ngogo. Chimps that spent their whole lives together stopped seeing each other as allies and treated each other the way that they treat rivals, with these brutal and horrifying attacks. But we asked Richard Wrangham about how different these attacks were from the ones he'd seen in other places, like his main study site, which is called Kibale, and he had something really surprising to say.
The Gombe attacks seem in some ways to be even slightly inhibited compared to the attacks that have been documented so richly elsewhere. And what I mean by that is that the Gombe attacks in every case led to a victim that was still alive at the time the attack stopped. And then they crawled away and died maybe hours, maybe days later. Whereas we have quite consistent killings on the spot in Kibale. So I don't think there's any evidence that the attacks were any more vicious in Gombe than elsewhere as a result of them coming on victims that they had known personally for some time. And in fact, they might even have been slightly less so.
We tend to think of war as an us thing, with generals and weapons and organized battle lines. But whether the Gombe conflict rises to the level of a war or not, maybe there's also a hint of something else people think of as an us thing. Mercy. So there's a lot we didn't even get to talk about with this, and there are a lot of big questions left unanswered. And of course, we all want to know what this says about humans. There's a temptation for us to take things that chimps do and use them to explain human nature. After all, that was Louis Leakey's whole deal: study the chimps to learn more about ourselves. But that's probably not the right way to look at this. For starters, even if this did mean that humans have some biological basis for warfare, that wouldn't make it morally right. Wild animals do lots of things that are completely natural, but that doesn't make them ethical, at least not if humans did them. Nobody's getting away with murdering their spouse by saying that praying mantises kill their mates after sex too. And chimps are not humans. Like I said, we did not evolve from them. But even for chimpanzee researchers, it's still a challenge not to draw connections between what we see in them and what we see in ourselves. Many say they struggle to keep their objectivity when it comes to studying these animals. They're our closest living relatives, after all. When it comes to warfare, we see something uncomfortable in this parallel, something dark, disgusting, and a little too familiar. Maybe we can think of what happened in the Chimp War as a mirror. The conclusions we reach depend on what we wanted to see. The shocking violence is one thing, sure, but there's more to this story. There's that idea that some of the chimps held back, perhaps out of recognition of their former group mates. There's the tenderness of Honeybee caring for her dying mother until she passed. The fighting in Gombe through the 70s was brutal, heartbreaking, and in many ways, pointless. Nobody ended up any better off than they started, and many ended up dead. Maybe the takeaway here is the sadness that this whole story leaves us with. Even if there is some fundamental human tendency to go to war, we also have the capacity to grieve its losses, to question its purpose, and to try to prevent it from happening again. If we only learn one thing from the chimpanzee war, it's that the costs of war are devastating for their species and our own.